It's always fun to see people go for the first time or even again because it's very eye-opening. People often get very emotional because it's such a contrast to our country. And at the same time, going to Cuba is another eye-opener to see the contrast of a country, one that in which there's a very high first world, as you would say, development in education, in science, in medicine, and consciousness of the people, and at the same time, basically a third world economic existence, very much largely due to the blockade. And it's historic underdevelopment, but the blockade that has kept Cuba from developing, that's literally killing people unnecessarily by the US determination to destroy the revolution. And I usually make my class usually lasts about 3 hours. I'm not going to punish you. I'm going to make it so we can have some time to talk. But there's so much to say about Cuban history. First thing is that Cubans will tell you the revolution did not begin January 1, 1959, when Batista was overthrown. They'll say that the revolution began October 10, 1868. The declaration of the first independence war. It's called the 10 Years' War. That's in an outline that I wrote up that Sharat will send you. And it was started by, I'm going to show, can I share the screen now?
Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm going to show some historic figures because you will see the names and the figures and you'll wonder, who are they? So rather than just like asking questions that you can instead know a little ahead of time and appreciate, the man at the top, the beige colored picture, is the father of the country. That's his title in the nation. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was a plantation owner. He owned slaves, but there was a growing sense of independence linked with the idea of abolishing slavery. And he's a father of the country because he called the people who were enslaved by him and nearby plantation owners to ring the bell of the Mahagua, as it's known, and to call for all to struggle for independence from Spain, 300 years of colonization, and the end of slavery. The war only lasted 10 years because it was a really early development. Most plantation owners did not want the end of slavery, did not want independence. So there was essentially disunity and lack of arms. Jose Marti on the right, most people probably have heard of him. Jose Marti is called the hero of the nation. The hero of the nation. He's really the intellectual figurehead. He formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party in the late 1800s and was really the political leader of the last independence war of 1895 to 1898. Jose Marti was actually imprisoned in the first independence war at the age of 15 by the Spaniards for daring to criticize a fellow student who was pro-Spain. He was put to hard labor as a teenager and he was exiled by Spain. For the rest of his life, he lived mostly abroad and lived for 18 years in New York City and came to understand the real nature of what came to be US imperialism and wrote and warned of that. The woman at the top, second person from the left, is the mother of the nation, and that is Mariana Grajales, a very famous figure in Cuba. And Mariana Grajales is known as the mother of the nation because her son, down here in the second row, Antonio Maceo, you will see a huge statue in Havana. It's the biggest statue in Cuba of Antonio Maceo, who's known also as the Bronze Titan. He was in all the independence wars. There was a little one called La Guerra Chiquita, the Little War. And he died in the last one, but he was a brilliant military general, regarded as one of the greatest military generals in any war. He was famous for his guerrilla warfare against the heavily armed Spaniards. He and his men, poorly armed, mostly with machetes, but he was extremely brilliant. He was also an intellectual. He didn't have much formal schooling, but he was truly an equal to others like Jose Marti. Maximo Gomez is the generalissimo. He was the main general. He was from Dominican Republic. So we'll stop there. Why is Mariana Grajales known as the mother of the nation? Because in the very early days of the Independence War of 1868, when some of the rebels came to their house of her family, they were Black, they were a free Black family. There were many people, Black people who were free, and they came to the house and asked for assistance. The father gave them 4 ounces of gold, gave him all his guns, whatever he could to help. And the mother, upon hearing of this independence war, made all her family kneel before her, her sons. She had 8 sons and her husband, and said, as certain as Jesus Christ is the first free man, you will all fight for your country's independence. And all of them died in battle or captured. And for that, she's known as the mother of the nation. So and Atue, the top left man, who's the name of our project, our medical aid project. Atue was an indigenous Taino man from what is now Dominican Republic and Haiti. And after the Spaniards ravaged his homeland, he took 400 men on canoe to fight the Spaniards in Cuba. And he was captured and burned at the stake on February 2nd, 1512. And as he was being prepared to be burned, the Spaniards asked him, do you accept Christianity and repent so that you can go to heaven? And he famously said, is that where you all are going? And they said, of course. And he said, I do not want to be with such cruel people, and refused. So he's the first resistor, the first hero of Cuba. So anyway, the reason I say these really early figures is because Cubans are very, very aware of their history, more than many people that I know. And they often make reference to these struggles. So that's part of my history. Cuba, being colonized by the Spaniards, was an enormous source of wealth for Spain. And it was one of the last colonies that it held on to. If you look at the map of Cuba, it's the biggest island of the Antilles. It is really the gateway from the Spaniards stealing the wealth of Latin America. And in their ships, they would stop off in Cuba, mostly Havana, and then prepare for the trip home. So it was very strategic for Spain. The biggest source of wealth was, of course, sugar and tobacco, but mainly sugar. The Cuban national identity of independence began to form in the early 1800s. And of course, the Independence War of 1868, the repression was very severe by the Spaniards. And in 1895, running forth from my usual history, by this time, Jose Marti has formed the Revolutionary Party of Cuba in the United States. He's calling for the unity of all Cubans. He goes to Tampa to meet in famous meetings with the cigar workers of Cuba and raises money, weapons for the final war of 1895. Slavery ended in Cuba in 1886. Cuba and Brazil were the last countries of the Western Hemisphere to eliminate slavery. By this time, though, a lot of slavery had been eliminated, but that was the formal ending of slavery. And this time in 1895, when the war breaks out, there is unity. There is success. In 3 years of war, again, outarmed, the Cuban people were winning the war against Spain. Spain sent up to 300,000 peasants and others that they conscripted to try to finally hold on to its empire. Of course, there was struggle in Puerto Rico and struggle in the Philippines as well at that time, but Spain was losing. And the US, which had always, since the time of Jefferson, regarded Cuba as one day belonging to it. You know, you would hear US leaders say, when the fruit ripens, when Spain is about to lose Cuba, it will be ours. Of course, during slavery, the slaveocracy often considered and looked with a jaundiced eye at Cuba, hoping that they could take that property as well. So here, the development of the successful war in 1895, the US prepares. They prepared politically, the American public to accept this new adventure. And for those of us who are older and remember an education when we had a little bit more education, I think, than now. Remember the Maine. What is Remember the Maine? Who can tell me what that was about?
Was that the ship that was blown up?
Yep.
By the nobody knows who officially. Was it the British? Was it the Americans? Was it the Cubans? It's like a bit of a mystery. Am I correct on that history?
You're correct. It was probably the first pretext of the US to engage in a war of aggression abroad. And this is considered the dawn of US imperialism, 1898. It was in early 1898, 3 years into the war, that the military naval ship, the USS Maine, steams into Havana Harbor. Oh, what a coincidence. As the officers are off the ship explodes and 270 sailors die. It was a pretext for the US to declare war on Spain at a time when Spain is basically defeated in Cuba. And sadly, by this time, Jose Marti had died. Jose Marti died within 3 months of the beginning of the war in 1895. And I'm going to skip to that moment because Jose Marti was not a fighter. He wasn't a warrior. And yet he insisted on being in battle. And his comrades said, no, you're the intellectual leader. You're the political leader. But he went to battle. And on May 18th, in his tent, he's writing to a Mexican friend, Manuel Mercado, a very famous letter in Cuban history. And in the letter, he essentially warns. He says, my whole life has been fighting for my country's independence. But he warns that the US could very well try to take over Cuba. And he says, and by that event, the US would throw its whole weight on the rest of Latin America. And he warns the Cuban people of this possibility, which is in fact what happened. The next morning, he gets on his horse, May 19, 1895, and he's shot dead by a bullet to his chest. Now, the reason I say this, yes, thank you, Adria, because in his letter, he says, I have lived in the monster and I know its entrails, the belly of the beast. So there is a statue in Central Park, New York City, that a very famous equestrian sculptor, a woman in her 80s, she was creating the statue of Jose Marti in his moment of death as he's being shot off the horse. And if you ever go to Central Park, look for it. It's in the southern point of Central Park. It's amazing that it's there. And for 20 years, the famed and beloved historian of Havana, who just recently died this year, Eusebio Leal, he worked for 20 years to make a replica of that statue. And in January 2018, I was fortunate to be invited to the unveiling of it. It's right in front. It's in the park right in front of what is now the Museum of the Revolution. I hope you all take time to go there and take a picture. I always take my delegations to take a picture at that statue. It's a magnificent statue, and it's a perfect replica. And when you see it, you realize it really belonged in Cuba. So these are the kind of little monuments that you can see on your trip. The Cubans, without Jose Marti's leadership, thought that the Americans are coming to help us win our freedom. The battle was already won, but the Cubans helped the US troops come in, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders come in, and the US began its occupation of 4 years. It was a very, very, very bitter pill for the Cubans to swallow, because in the signing of the treaty that took place in Paris in the beginning of 1899, but the surrender of the Spaniards in Cuba, which took place in Santiago de Cuba, the cradle of the revolution in eastern Cuba, the Cuban rebel forces were all banned from taking part in that surrender. They were not a party to this. Now, what do we know that war that began with the USS Maine explosion, what do we in the US know that war as?
I can let somebody else go too, but the U.S. Well,
Spanish American.
yeah, thank you.
Spanish American. So where's Cuba in this title? It was brought on by Cuba's independence that was snatched from it. And so that's why when the US now is saying, oh, democracy, we're going to help bring freedom to Cuba, it's like, no, thank you. We've had our history with your democracy. And these are the kind of things. The US occupied Cuba for 4 years directly. And they couldn't continue because of this enormous desire for true independence. So the US left in 1902, but not before they basically engineered the new Cuban Constitution for this, what is really a pseudo-republic. And in the Constitution was included something really ignominious called the Platt Amendment, named after Senator Platt, P-L-A-T-T. And the Platt Amendment said 2 main points: that the US has the right to intervene in Cuba militarily whenever its national interests are affected. That's literally what it says. It also says that the US has the right to set up coaling stations, to be able to have this very heavy fuel for its military adventures abroad as a stop-off point, coaling stations. And that's how Guantanamo base was established. Not only a base, but 47 square miles of Cuban territory that to this day is occupied. Imagine, the US military occupies Cuban territory and is actually a point of danger for Cuba. So those 2 things were really, really hard for Cubans to accept. And there was huge debate among the Cubans whether to accept this so-called new freedom or to continue fighting. And in the end, they chose to accept it as a step toward future independence. That period from 1902 to 1934 is known as the pseudo-republic. But the same as what happened in the United States and worldwide, the 1929 economic capitalist crash greatly affected Cuba, of course, the world. In Cuba, it meant that the price of sugar that was in the high 20s cents per pound, although the US determined the price, the US really ruled over Cuba's sugar industry since its takeover. The price fell to less than a penny a pound with the crash. And this meant starvation, death, huge economic downturn, 40% unemployment for anybody over the age of 13. But it also spelled, the same as in the US, great worker struggles. What happened in the United States, the communist socialists helped lead the formation of the great industrial unions from the steel workers, auto workers, and so much more. As well as in the United States, thousands of wildcat strikes took place. In Cuba, the same. Here's another historic figure who you will see in different pictures. And this man in the second row to the right, Julio Antonio Mella, was, as a 22-year-old, the founder of the Cuban Communist Party. of 1925. He was also the founder of the great Federation of University Students, the FEU, which is also a current organization of the university students. Julio Antonio Mella, in 1925, and 15 other people formed the Communist Party of Cuba, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution. And he led the struggle, one of the struggles against the dictator of the 20s, Gerardo Machado. You don't have to know his name, but there was a dictatorship of the late 20s at the behest of the US. Julio Antonio had to flee for his safety to Mexico, but Machado sent an agent to murder him, and he was killed there. After a struggle, his remains were brought back to Cuba. And if you go to the University of Havana, right in central Havana, will you be going on that trip, Sharat?
Yes, he will.
Okay,
Yes.
so if you go to the University of Havana, I hope you take time to walk around. Right across the street is a little park, and his monument is there. And that's where Julio Antonio Mella, I'm not sure exactly where, but right there.
Yeah, it's right in front of the main entrance.
Yeah, there's a monument to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll see the historic dates of his life. So just so you get to know who he is. He was a great, great figure. Amazing young revolutionary. But here it is. The US is fearful that it's about to lose control in Cuba because of these great worker struggles. The Communist Party of Cuba called for people to establish Soviets. You know, workers took over sugar plantations and the sugar mills, a small number of sugar mills. It was a time in which the US realized, if we don't get rid of this symbol, this dictator, Gerardo Machado, we may lose it entirely. So came the revolutionary struggle of 1933 and what's called the Sergeants' Revolt of September 4. This is where Fulgencio Batista comes in. Fulgencio Batista was a sergeant. He was basically a stenographer for higher ups, but he had great influence in the military, and he was very relied on by the United States. Sumner Welles was the ambassador who came in to try to rescue the situation, and basically Gerardo Machado was overthrown to try to quell the struggles. But in addition, so Batista became the puppet master for the next many years until he became president. But there was a government of 100 days. It was called the government of 100 days that had to recognize this huge revolutionary and worker struggles that were taking place and the great anger of the people for economic relief, for justice, for an end to the repression of the dictatorship. And so the government of 100 days was basically a coalition of left, right, and center. And among them was a very heroic figure, Antonio Guiterres. And he was the Minister of the Interior. What the government did was establish the 8-hour day for the first time, and other labor reforms, autonomy for the University of Havana, a minimum wage, many, many other things. It allowed for basic unionization, much like what happened with the New Deal. Not as extensive, but many changes came about. And the big one of 1934 was the elimination of the Platt Amendment from the Constitution. And therefore, the US could no longer say that they would intervene anytime they felt like it, although they tried in 1961. But the US never left Guantanamo to this day. But the Platt Amendment was removed. That's the end of the pseudo-republic. It shows you how deep the struggle was. And from there came a series of presidents. Batista was elected in 1940. You could only serve one term for 4 years. The 40s and the 50s was a scene of great corruption, massive enrichment by the leaders. Mafiosos come in and set up what they hoped would be what later became Las Vegas, Nevada. Casinos were built, Many of the hotels that you see, the old hotels in downtown Havana, were built in the late 1950s, from the Havana Hotel, which is now the Havana Libre, to the Riviera, to the Capri. They all were led by mafiosos with great casinos. Cuba was a time of huge poverty. And Batista decides to run again in 1952. By this time, the CIA was very entrenched in Latin America and many parts of the world. You know, the end of World War II, the US decides it will be the dominant force of the world. And they feared what was developing in Latin America since the 40s, great independence struggles, leftist struggles. That's why in 54, Guatemala's liberal government was overthrown. The CIA was also very involved in Cuba. And in 1952, they realized that they're about to lose an election that they were hoping Batista would win. Fidel actually was a young 25-year-old lawyer who was running in the Orthodox Party for Congress. He was in the youth wing, the leftist wing of the Orthodox newly formed party. But then on March 10, 1952, Batista declares martial law. He had such great influence in the military, shut down Congress, abolished the Constitution. On the third day of this martial law, Fidel Castro, this young lawyer, walks into court and demands the arrest of Batista for violating the 1940 Constitution, which basically was a liberal constitution. And of course, that didn't go anywhere because Batista ruled for the next 7 years as a dictator. But what it meant, what Fidel was showing was the legal road is no longer possible. And he immediately began training up to 1,300 men for revolutionary armed battle. Fidel was, when you read his life, he was a brilliant strategist and tactician. And interestingly, even though there was this, what was called BRAC, B-R-A-C, the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activity, established by the CIA, run by the Cubans, a very fierce, brutal police force, the rural guards, the army. It was so repressive that 20,000 Cubans were murdered. Workers, peasants, students were murdered during the 7 years of Batista dictatorship in a country that by that time was probably 6.5 million people. 20,000 people meant like just a bloody regime. And yet Fidel's movement was never detected by the CIA or Batista's men until historic date, 15 months after the declaration of this martial law by Batista, on July 26th, in the cradle of the revolution, Santiago de Cuba in the east, Fidel leads some 100 men to take on a battle against Batista. The Moncada assault. Moncada is the name of the military base in Santiago, right in the urban center. And Fidel's plan that he announced to his men that night was, we're going to take the base by surprise. You know, it was carnival time. He figured our soldiers would be drunk or sleeping, and take weapons and go into the mountains for a prolonged war. Not a prolonged war, a guerrilla war. But what happened was a complete disaster. Of his 100 men, actually, as he denounced to his men what the plan was, he said, anybody who doesn't want to take part is welcome to step back. And the students that he had trained stepped back. They didn't take part in this struggle. But the rest went to the base, and within hours, most of them were captured. Only 6 were killed in battle, but the rest, 70 men, were tortured and brutally murdered. There's a very famous incident, a very sad, infamous incident. There were 2 women in this struggle. They weren't in battle, but they were there to help as nurses, Aide Santa Maria and Melba Hernandez. And Aide Santa Maria's brother was Fidel's right-hand man, Abel Santa Maria. And as the 2 women were captured, one of the soldiers comes to Aide with her brother's eye in his hand. And he said, we've taken your brother's eye, and if you don't tell us the plans of what they were doing, we're going to take his other eye out. And she said, if my brother won't speak, why should I? Well, they took his eye and they tortured him along with the others. And it was a huge defeat. But July 26th to this day is the biggest holiday in Cuba because it spelled the beginning of the war against Batista and the last stage of Cuba's struggle for independence and what became the socialist revolution. After a couple of weeks, Fidel, Raul, his brother, and another historic figure among many. This is at the bottom, Juan Almeida Bosque, the second man from the left. Juan Almeida was one of the comandantes in the guerrilla war later, and he was a very beloved figure. Here's somebody else here, Jesus Menendez. In this row, the man on the left, he was a great labor leader. He was called the Sugar General. He led the sugar workers of the plantation and the mills in great struggle against U.S. domination for an improvement in their lives, in their wages and conditions. And he was assassinated in 1947. So I'll put that down. I don't want to go too much into it. But basically what happens is that Fidel, Raul, Juan Almeida, and other men are captured. Some dozen men are captured. They're put on trial. And on October 16, 1953, a few months after the battle, they're put on trial and sentenced from 15 to 20 years. Fidel gave a 4-hour speech before the judges. Amazing that he could do that. But he gave a speech that became what is known as the Moncada program. It was the vision of a new Cuban future. And he said, I am responsible. I'm fully responsible for this. But the intellectual author of our war is Jose Marti. And in it, this 4-hour speech, he laid out what he felt that Cuban society needed to be: industrialized, true freedom, the end of repression, education for all, employment for all, the right of the peasantry to have their land reform, the right to housing. And I usually in my class have people read a page and a half of the final part of his speech because it's truly amazing. It's truly revolutionary and very inspiring, but we won't do that right now unless you want. So anyway, it's amazing because every time people read it in my class, they go, oh my God, he's talking about the US today. You know, how much people had to pay for their rent, how poor people were. So they're sentenced. They engage in an education school in prison. And after 15 months, Batista gives them amnesty. He frees them all. Was it because he was such a good guy? No, he was killing people in the street. But they were so popular in the country. People finally had a leader that they could trust and follow. That Batista, because he was attempting to hold new elections in that year, felt that as a concession, he'll free them. But he said, but they have to agree and sign a document that they will not continue the struggle. Fidel said, forget it. We don't accept such a disgusting offer. We refuse. And Batista was forced to give them unconditional amnesty. This is a kind of boldness of Fidel. So they're freed. Fidel soon announces to the public that he's leaving, but he says, I will be back either dead or victorious. He goes to Mexico. He trains another dozens of men, gets more weapons. That's where he meets Che Guevara very soon after he arrived. And that night, after hours of talk, Che writes his mother and says, I have met the man that I will join my fate to. And that's how it was. They buy a yacht. It's not really a yacht. It's a small boat. It's behind the Museum of the Revolution in a glass encased monument. And hopefully you can see that. The museum itself is closed because it's being digitized and updated. And because of the cost due to the pandemic. But I think you can go around the back and see the Granma. and other museum pieces. They get on this boat, 82 men, in this little bitty vessel, and they land on December 2nd, 1956. December 1956. That's considered the anniversary of the founding of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, the military of Cuba today. Within days, they're bombed. Many of them die. Batista discovers that they've landed and bombs them, and only a few survive or remain in the struggle. Some others just basically gave up. They find themselves in the woods after 2 or 3 weeks. Fidel finds his brother, he finds Che, he finds Juan Almeida, and other revolutionaries. And he asks his brother, how many guns do we have? Raul says 7. Fidel said, good, we're going to win the revolution. 2 years and a month later, Batista's forced to flee. Did he multiply those guns like the fishes? How did it happen? Why do you think he was successful? How could he know? How could he know that they would be successful? Was it just he had a crystal ball? Can someone tell me? Can someone guess?
If anybody else, I'm just gonna guess. I want to say it's because of I'm not a war strategist, but it's the Sierra Maestra. That was part of his strategy because of the geography, because of the actual conditions of that, and that he knew it well. That's my best guess on that.
And I'll say it was because of the incredible support he got from campesinos, the working class, and intellectuals. The organized country against Batista.
Exactly. And the people knew this was not another leader who was going to deceive them and just hand power from one dictator to another, that it was going to be something that would free them from the oppression and misery that they lived. Because the Moncada program, by the way, it became a book, and it was printed in secret by patriotic people who, printed this thing out in their basements. And the 2 women who I mentioned in the uprising, Aide Santa Maria and Melba Hernandez, they were in prison for like a number of months. They took on the role as the principal distributors of that book through the island. Tens of thousands of copies. If they had been caught, they would have been killed. But they did this heroically. And people grew to know this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for a real change. So, and there was also these brilliant battles. Adria, you're right. It's all of this. And but Fidel could say that because he knew that the people were ready to fight. And if you read that last page and a half, you'll see that he knew this. So on January 1st, Batista takes off. The next 2.5 years, we're running quickly now. The next 2.5 years were amazing revolutionary measures. By March, medicine and rents were cut in half. Did they have an army to go enforce it? No, you just tell people in the media, your rents are cut in half. So everyone pays their landlord half. What court's gonna enforce evictions? The overthrow of Batista meant that the state, the police, the courts, the army, the rural guards, it basically vanished. And in came the rebel army and the people to enforce these new measures. The beaches had been restricted to Black people. There was great segregation in the country. That was lifted, that was banned. May 17, 5 months into the revolution, the great agrarian reform law is signed. But it was not Fidel was very concerned that it not just be a division of plots of land to the peasantry and then division and division as the generations go. And he engaged in a major education that what was needed was collectivization of the land. So most of the land reform involved turning what was privately U.S. and Cuban big landlords into state farms, mainly like sugar and large production. The limit was of 2,300 acres, and later it was reduced to 1,000 acres maximum holdings. But the American owned land was taken over, and people in the countryside were encouraged to develop collectives, cooperatives, and from there they were able to share their implements and also get development from the state of, clinics, stores, all those kind of things that encouraged collectivization. And that's why it was not a forced agricultural reform. And by the way, most of the peasantry was actually proletarian. They were mostly sugar workers. They weren't like eking out on a small plot of land. Most of the peasantry had more of a working class consciousness, even though they're peasantry. 1960 was the first urban reform law, and that was where everybody was declared the owner of anywhere that they lived. So landlordism was basically eliminated in 2 urban reforms, 1 year after the other. The government didn't have to pay the landlords, their money, didn't have to pay the banks. They just said no more landlordism, because when you think about it, it's the workers who built every piece of housing, and now they own their housing. Many reforms. In 61, I think it was, the Soviet Union began to send oil, the first shipments of oil into Cuba. And the US ordered Esso and Texaco not to refine that oil because they had refineries on the island. And after a standoff of several weeks and running out of fuel, Fidel holds a major rally. And by the way, every measure that he carried out was with masses of up to 1 million people in the square, in which he would ask them, are you for this? They would raise their hand, the vast majority, of course, practically everybody. And that was the most democratic thing that ever happened in Cuba, was these rallies and actions. So in that rally, he says, if they're going to not let us have our oil and development, that's where he announced the nationalization of the banks, the railroads, all the communications that the U.S. owned, the rest of U.S. properties. That was like the great nationalization. And of course, came the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Eisenhower administration had already planned an extensive program of terrorism, biological warfare, bombings, assassinations, the blockade, which was signed by Kennedy, February 2nd, 1962, that exists to this day. 1968, Cuba nationalizes all the rest of Cuban properties. Even the small shop owners, everything that was held privately was now in state hands. It was a complete socialist economy. Cuba was helped enormously, by the way, with its relationship with the Soviet Union. And there's a book I recommend that you get. You can get it at the airport in English, or you can get it in bookstores, but certainly you'll find it at the airport when you're leaving. I highly recommend it. It's in English. It's one of the best ways to learn of Cuban history. It's the biography of Raul Castro, and it's called A Man in Revolution. It's too long to explain why, but it's a fantastic book, written by a Soviet man who Raul met as a 20-year-old on a ship heading from Europe to Cuba before the Moncada attack. They became lifelong friends. And this is how the Soviet Union first met Fidel, was through this man. Anyway, so Cuba had to face the impending U.S. invasion, because the U.S. decided we're not going to accept this anymore. And that was the Bay of Pigs. But this is 2.5 years into the war. The day before the Bay of Pigs invasion, at a funeral of several people who were killed by U.S. bombing as a prelude to the war. The cortege leaves the cemetery at 12th and 23rd Street. You can go by there too. And Fidel prepared a speech at that spot after the funeral of these people who were killed. The war is about to happen. Cuba doesn't know where the invasion will come from, but they know it's coming. And Fidel is on a high platform, and he gives another historic speech, April 16, 1961. And he says, how many of you agree with the urban reform? Yes, Fidel, yes. How many of you agree with the expropriation of the land and the land to the peasant? Yes, Fidel. And how many of you agree? Blum, blum, blum. He mentions all the programs. And he says, that is socialism. And that's what we're fighting for. And he said, and what the imperialists hate more than anything is that we're building a socialist revolution under their very noses. There's a plaque at that point. This is like April 61. And that's called the Declaration of the Socialist Character of the Revolution. Fidel had never mentioned socialism before. They talked about revolution. The people weren't afraid of that. He talked about all the things that people benefited from, which they were all for, except for the rich, who had all left by then. But because anti-communism was so fierce, as it was here in the 50s, practically he decided that's not a good thing to be talking about. What we have to talk about is the things people understand. And so finally, in the midst of this war, he said, it's time that we learn what it is we are fighting for, socialism. So Cuba's victorious in 72 hours. They defeat the mercenaries because the people were in this struggle. And illiteracy was wiped out in that year. I don't know if you're going to go to the Museum of Literacy, but it's the most fantastic place to go. It will bring tears to your eyes. About the 100,000 youth and the teachers. School was basically suspended in 61 so that people go into the countryside and in the city to help bring literacy to every Cuban. By the end of the year, even the United Nations recognized that Cuba was a territory free of illiteracy, another great gain. So, Cuba developed. Cuba had its relations with the socialist camp. When the US cut off the sugar quota, the Soviet Union said, we will buy 5 million tons of your sugar every year. China said, we will buy 1 million tons. And that was the relationship with the socialist camp. Of course, the split between the Soviet Union and China meant that China basically for a long time declared Cuba as an enemy, like they did the Soviet Union, but that's just an anomaly. 1991, when the Soviet Union disappeared, by this time for 2 years, the Soviet Union had already begun stopping all its contracts with Cuba. Eastern Europe had already fallen. East Germany was a great trading partner of Cuba. Those contracts stopped. Cuba was dependent on 85% of its imports from the socialist camp. This brought about a huge economic downturn in the 1990s, starting in 1989. From 89 to 93, Cuba suffered a 34.5% drop in their economy. Factories had to close down. It was devastating. I went there many, many times then, in material aid, support, and solidarity with Cuba. And it was very sad. It was really heartbreaking to see what people had to go through. The caloric intake of Cubans fell from a normal 2,500 to 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day. This was months and months, years of deprivation. But you never saw rebellions. You never saw riots. You never saw food fights. Never. People endured together, and they had a slogan. They called it, in English, resist, 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 and overcome. That was the watchword, led by Fidel, who said famously 2 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, he held a speech at Antonio Maceo's gravesite. Remember, the Bronze Titan, the general of the independence wars. And he said, we can't imagine We were seeing terrible things developing in the Soviet Union, reaction, support for the United States. He said, and we can't imagine this great bulwark of socialism disappearing. But if it were to disappear, we Cubans will hold high the flag of socialism to the last Cuban. And he uttered a famous phrase of Antonio Maceo. And from there began their struggle to survive and to defend. The Cubans called it defending the socialist gains, not building socialism in that period. They weren't deepening socialist measures. They were, in fact, incorporating capitalist-style reforms formally in 1993. And what was it? Allowing self-employment for the first time, reducing state employment by 250,000 people who got unemployment benefits, but then they were placed in other jobs, allowing for the farmers, after they met their quota to the state to provide basic food for everybody, allowing the farmers to grow and to charge as much as they wanted for the extra production as an incentive to farmers who no longer had tractors or oil to run tractors or tires or fertilizer or insecticide. The farmers had to just eke out a living with oxen. You know, it's about 1/8 the production of tractor production. And it was an extremely hard time, but Cuba had to free up the initiative of the Cuban people to get through this. This is also a time, a few years before, that Fidel started to call for the scientists to engage in study of biotechnology. He sent scientists abroad to learn from European scientists, for example, the production of interferon, which was a marvel in the world. Today, Cuba is a powerhouse in biotechnology. So Cuba survived and began to develop by foreign investment and by tourism. Thousands of hotel rooms were built in the 1990s. And starting in 1996, after this, what's called the special period in time of peace, this resistance period, the Cuban economy began to grow very slowly in 1996. By the early 2000s, the fact that Sherritt Corporation of Canada started up Cuba's nickel production by investing in it, you know, they became a partner. For example, nickel became the number 2 source of income for Cuba. Number 1 was tourism. This shows how Cuba was able to adapt from losing trade with the Eastern Socialist camp to now finding its way in a capitalist-dominated world. Foreign investment, tourism, biotechnology, the export of professional services, including sending doctors abroad and teachers who would get some income, a higher income abroad, but the state would also benefit so that the people could have medicine and food. Back to nickel. Nickel is, Cuba is the 2nd or 3rd largest store of nickel in the world, a strategic metal. By 2008, nickel was reaching a very high price on the commodities market in the world. And it was half of Cuba's foreign income. $50,000 a ton was what Cuba was making. They made $3.5 billion from this $50,000 a ton, brought in a lot of money. It was never the same level as before the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was a great help. What happened in 2008 in the United States? What economic thing happened in the US? 2008.
The Occupy movement, what you call it, some bubbles burst.
Housing.
There you go.
Mhm.
Yeah,
The housing crisis.
The crisis, right.
A recession, really, a major recession. The collapse of commodity prices in the world, but the rise of food prices. Cuba was in great quandary. Cuba's nickel, how much did it say? How much was it earning by 2008? What did I tell you? What was it?
50,000 a ton?
50,000 a ton. It dropped to 9,000 $9,000, $10,000 a ton. So if you lose 75 to 80% of what was half of your income, foreign earnings, hard currency, which is the only way they can buy things, because Cuba's money is worth nothing abroad. Cuba cannot exchange any of its money, its pesos, nor its two currencies that it had till 2 years ago. It can't exchange any of its money abroad. It's worth nothing. The only money that they can get is from foreign earnings. And it dropped in half. So in 2008, by this time, Fidel had to resign because he almost died. He lived 10 more years, but he had to resign for his health. And Raul became the interim president. But in 2008, he became the formal president. And he gave a speech about the crisis, a new crisis that Cuba was facing. Again, remember, the blockade is the main factor in their crisis. And he described that food prices were going up so high that their foreign income had dropped so greatly. And they decided to expand the economic reforms that they had engaged in the 90s, to saying that at some point they would have to eliminate up to 1 million workers of the 3 million who are state employed, and to allow those workers to become self-employed, to expand the rights of workers to more jobs than they were permitted before. It was very restricted before. And up to this point right now, it's about, well, maybe up to a year ago, it was 650,000 people who are self-employed. But they're also allowed to have not only what was then a 12 seats in a restaurant, and that you couldn't hire anyone else. Now, as of the last year or so, they have something called MYPEMES, MYPEMES, meaning micro, small, and medium-sized companies. Now Cubans themselves are allowed to own micro, small, or medium companies in order to grow the economy, allow for initiative by the people to find the means to raise production in the country. Cuba's going through a huge crisis right now. From the 243 measures that Trump employed in his 4 years, in the height of the pandemic, the right of Cubans in the U.S. to send remittances to their people was cut off completely. In the midst of a pandemic where all tourism was shut down in Cuba, the #1 source of income for the country and employment, all tourism was shut down so that people could survive. Taxis, buses, nothing was allowed in the street for the first year in order to save the people. In the first year of the pandemic, from March to December, 146 people died by this very harsh but necessary measure. It was a lot of economic dislocation. Nobody got evicted because everybody owns their house. But it was hard. In the first, starting like about April, the president, Diaz-Canel, said to the scientists, we have to create our own vaccines. And that's what they did. They created 5 lines of vaccine, 3 which are employed, 3 which are highly effective. Now, the year 2021 was very hard for the Cubans. I was there 4 times. Remember, no tourism was basically allowed. The country was still shut down. In the year before the pandemic, Cuba had 4.5 million tourists. Remember that figure, 4.5 million tourists. The next year, the pandemic, 125,000 people entered the country. Imagine the loss of income, the loss of foreign income to buy food. 2021, 125,000 people, but in came COVID. There was already COVID, but when I was there in June of 2021, the rate of positive cases per day was 1,000, then it became 3,000. By August, 9,000 to almost 10,000 people a day were getting COVID, and dozens were dying. It was really, really so hard to see Cubans, while at the same time these vaccines were being developed. We in the US, Canada, and the world, many of us were part of the gathering of money to send millions of syringes to help Cuba vaccinate. In Cuba, there is no debate about vaccination. There's not this craziness of politicians like a president telling you not to vaccinate or telling you that it's a game. You don't have to wear a mask. In Cuba, everyone wore masks. People respect their health care, respect their government. But in 2021, 8,200 people died, from 146 in the first year to 8,200 people, because it just was spreading. And yet, in 2021, Cuba said, because they know their population, it's organized, the country is an organized state. They calculated by November 15, we will be fully vaccinated. On November 15, 2021, we're going to open up tourism completely. All the kids will go back to school in person, masked, but safe. Cuba's open for business. But you remember last July, in the depths of this crisis, when so many people were dying and thousands going positive, that the US decided to employ one of their tactics in hoping to destabilize the country, create chaos, and bring about a possibility of color revolution, which is kind of a joke in Cuba. But it was very serious. And that's where those disturbances of July 11 took place, when Cuba was at its worst point. It didn't succeed, but the CIA, the US, is always there. Right now in Cuba, because of the total vaccination by November last year, this year, if you look at their statistics, from May to September of 2022, one person died. One person died in Cuba. Everyone's vaccinated in Cuba. And the number of cases, because, you know, you can still get COVID with vaccination and tourism. But in Cuba, 10, 12, 9 people a day are positive. Still, I recommend for you all that you wear your masks on your bus, if you're in a bus, that you wear your mask, you know, like we do here for those who are more careful. You know, I just got COVID. I just got over it. I'm triple boosted. It's coming back. So the biggest challenges for Cuba right now is their foreign income is greatly reduced. Their imports have had to go way down. Food is scarce. They're not starving, but they're not getting the kind of food that they need. There's a shortage of protein and other things like that. There are days when you might even find yourself that there's no bread. I'm not sure if you're staying in a hotel, but there'll be times when there's no bread or milk. This is true for most Cubans. The electrical power system of the island is decrepit. These are electrical power plants that, because of the blockade and Cuba not being able to import spare parts that are, you know, these were created mostly by the US and also the Soviet Union, that these cauldrons for heating the water that's necessary for the fuel are basically porous. You'd be shocked to see them. And the heroic electrical workers are constantly working night and day to try to repair one that went down, another one that went down. The Hurricane Ian, which hit the western part of the island, destroyed all the tobacco industry. That's where tobacco is grown, another source of income. 6,000 curing houses, which are, you know, sheds to cure the tobacco, blown away completely, because the hurricane was a 4, but it stayed for 7 hours over the island, a very long time. It just hung there, destroying. 19,000 homes were disappeared. A couple of 100,000 greatly damaged. So, you know, Venezuela, Mexico has sent in help. We have a a group called Atue, which I'll put in the website. We're collecting money right now. We're at the point of filling a ship container of 36,000 pounds of 500 sheets of sheet metal for roofing, concrete to fill the rest. And we sent $20,000 worth of burn medicine because another disaster in early August, you probably heard about it, an enormous fire that burned 4 tanks of millions of gallons of fuel in Matanzas province. 15 firefighters were killed. And again, Venezuela, Mexico came to their rescue, along with the firefighters of Cuba. So I'm going to end there, and I apologize. I took too long.